So today we're here with part 2 of all the science fiction fantasy I've been reading recently because I got backlogged with my review videos when I was on bed rest, and then I read a lot more. So this video is covering most of the things I read when I was flat out on my back. Long story short, I had the stomach flu, I pulled my oblique muscle horribly, and it took me a while to recover. So I'm back in action, I am sitting up, which is amazing, and I'm here to tell you about more science fiction fantasy books. It's going to be a combination of new releases as well as some backlist titles, some chunky monkeys that I'm finally ticking off my TBR this year. If that sounds good, let's get started. First, let's start with science fiction, starting with Service Model by Adrian Tchaikovsky, one of their newest releases coming out this year. I think there's at least one more Alien Clay that's either out or will be out, but this is the first one I've read, and this is one that follows a domestic robot that gets this ugly little program downloaded that gives them the idea to murder their human. And so within the story, that is just the premise, the setup, the start, and then we're following them with the consequences of everything that comes afterwards. So that is just the start, and then really instead we're following afterwards. So we have the investigators that are coming in and trying to sort it out, and the story moves forward from there. This is one that definitely feels reminiscent of Murderbot. It's not the same story by any means, but instead it feels like the author is kind of taking that same premise and then taking it in a different direction, assumingly kind of focusing on a different version of saying, okay, what if you have an robot without emotions and they're dealing with humans and they don't necessarily love humans, and kind of extrapolating that. So if you just love some of the premise of Murderbot, but not necessarily the cozy humanistic aspects to it, which I would argue was probably the best part, this one has similar feels. I've seen some critical reviews that complain that this book lacks emotion and that the characters read very flat. I will agree with that, but a few things to keep in mind. One being the fact that I have read Adrian Tchaikovsky many times before, and that's pretty much always my critique of his books, is I don't think he writes characters exceptionally well, or at least it's not the part that he finds interesting or his focus in his stories. And so if you're looking for really well-rounded, multifaceted, emotional characters at the center of these stories, you won't get that here. However, as I mentioned, the character here, the protagonist, is a robot, and so I feel like he gets away with that in a way that doesn't always work in some of his other books, because of the fact that this robot doesn't have feelings and is seeing the world in a very black and white way. They are, of course, trying to grow and learn, but I think the flatness of the character actually works and feels more intentional, even if I think it's a little bit just the way their author writes people or individuals. But in this case, I think it actually fit the story quite well. So compared to other readers, I'm less of a mega fan of this author. Some of their books I like and some of them less so. And thankfully this one fell more on the side of being a hit rather than a miss. I think it was a solid 4 stars for me. I think it accomplished what it was trying to do. It had some interesting ideas explored within the narrative, and I would definitely recommend it to those that are looking for something like that. Next up, we have Ghost of the Neon God by T.R. Napper, and this is the same author who wrote 36 Streets, a cyberpunk book I've recommended several times on my channel. And so this is a novella, so it's quite short, just to keep that in mind, and it's not related directly to that other book that I love. Instead, this one is set in futuristic Australia, and we follow this criminal who is on the run. And really what this is an action-packed thriller set in a futuristic world, or having that in the background. And my enjoyment of this one unfortunately reflects the fact that I don't love those kind of stories. I thought the writing was good in the same way that I could see echoes of what I loved in 36 Streets, but in terms of the plot, it just felt very hollow. It's just this criminal on the run, and again, I already gave you the premise, and that's kind of all there is to the story. I think it's well done for what it is, but it's not the kind of story that I really tend to enjoy. If you're looking for more of the sci-fi aspects, they're technically there. Yes, we're in a future, but it's much more of that action-packed story that for me lends itself more to the kind of movies my father-in-law watches, and just not the kind of stories that I personally like consuming. So this one was a miss for me. It just was not a genre or topic I found particularly interesting in. I would still read more by this author because I think they have potential, but I need to be mindful that I think I need to be sure that I'm picking books that they write that fit with my reading taste a little better. Next is Moonstorn by Yoon Ha Lee, one of my favorite SFF authors, and this is a piece of young young adult science fiction, a genre or age category I don't often read a lot of, but I did because of this author. In the story, we follow a young woman or kind of teenager in this range where they, as a child, were orphaned. They had their home destroyed by this imperial power and are then forced to kind of go through and train and learn within this nation and become a soldier, essentially. And so what we follow them is they are getting trained, they're going through and actually getting to work with robotic mechs. And so if you love mechs from animes, you're going to have that aspect in here. And so they're learning to fight. However, of course, their heart is not in it. Really, they want to rebel. And it's a story of someone who is kind of forced to work within a system and then, you know, just trying to push against it, which definitely feels reminiscent of Phoenix Extravagant. I like this one. It reminded me of what I think Skyward by Brandon Sanderson is. I've never read that one, but I think it's kind of similar premise with another pilot at the center of the story. And for me, I like this one. I thought it was good. I would easily gift this to a young person if I had someone in my life in kind of that range of interests and so forth. But for myself, it didn't quite hit the mark. And I'm going to try to say this without sounding like a weirdo. But one of the things I love most about this author's adult work is that they tend to bring in a lot of humor, which is often drawn from adult situations. So some of it being kind of more sexual, sometimes just inappropriateness for me is actually one of my favorite kind of humors. I don't often convey that on camera just for the sake of the internet being a weird place. But for me, I love with the Yoon Ha Lee series like Machineries of Empire, I think that it's great because it has this kooky underlying humor that you can't get away with in a young adult book. So my criticism of this book is really unfair, is that it's very clean, which is appropriate for a teenager. Again, a book that I would safely give to a young adult. But because of that, the cleanness also made the series feel a bit dry. There are some attempts at humor, but for me, they again are very safe, clean jokes that kind of make it a very safe story. So I think that again, it's great for the audience. I don't think it has as much adult appeal as I would like. I will definitely still read more by this author. They have some middle grade I do want to check out, but I suspect I'm going to have the same challenge with those ones here. Is I just like when the author goes straight up adult, does not shy away from those aspects, and I have a lot of fun with it. Don't judge me too much. Now let's switch over to fantasy, starting with The Last Fae Hunter by Salinee Goldenberg. And this is a book that follows a Fae hunter, which essentially is this ghost demon hunter. And they are going about their way when they come across this person on the run. They are pregnant and ask for their help getting through these forests that are filled with ghosts and other otherworldly things. Now, this is a book I went into with high expectations because of the fact that I'm always a sucker for kind of ghost demon type of hunter type setups. I've attempted to read so many stories like this that I've wanted to love and just kind of didn't work for me. And so I was really hoping that this would be the book that nailed the topic and the subject matter that I wanted to love so much. And I'm happy to say it actually did. I had a great time with it. It wasn't a 5-star read for me. And I think it's the fact that I didn't find the characters to be the most complex or the most interesting. Like really the 5-star reads, I tend to have like a really good emotional connection with the characters in a way that I didn't hear. But I think this book is doing so much that I love. I thought that the premise was great. And then the delivery was just as good. I thought the writing was solid. I have to look if this is a debut novel, but if it is, it does not feel like one. I thought the world building was lush. And I think one thing that I struggle with when it comes to these kind of ghost fighting stories is that they're typically written in what I'll call a traditional urban fantasy narrative, which tends to be really heavy on the romance and kind of very hollow or thin in terms of the world building. And this one was quite the opposite. I think that while it has a theme that is typically explored in more urban fantasy, it's done in a way that is going to absolutely appeal to people like me that much more prefer secondary or epic fantasy, where it is in this otherly world and the author takes a lot of time to explore and share the nuances of the world, how this person became a hunter and all of the backstory and the nuances of that. Like, I just think for me, this book was just fascinating to read. So I loved it a lot. Definitely a contender for favorite of the year. And I do recommend it if you're someone like me who again is looking for stories that are a little bit different, a little bit out of the box, not so much the traditional fantasy narratives. This one Definitely it has its tropes, but I loved it a lot. Next is Fae Bound, and this was a wonderful surprise, a bit of a hidden gem, at least for me. It's a book that came up available through my library, and I checked it out knowing nothing about it, and I was pleasantly surprised to really enjoy my time with it. So this is one I love that is set in a secondary world, and we're not only following characters in this other place, but specifically we're following from the perspective of elves rather than, say, humans, which I thought was a great start. So we follow an elf and her sister. Right at the beginning of the story, something happens and the one is exiled and the other sister comes along. And so kind of a traditional setup where you have characters that are taken out of their comfort zone and moved somewhere else. And it's not a spoiler, it's right in pretty much the title of the story that they end up coming across this group of Fae. And this is very surprising because as far as they were concerned, Fae have not existed in, I believe, a millennia. They were supposed to have long died out thousands of years ago. And so they then find out that this is all real, and of course the story evolves from there. This is one that, again, just felt like it was doing something a little bit different. Certainly it leaned into fancy tropes, but I felt like it did so in a way that just was interesting rather than feeling predictable. I love the sisterly relationship. These were two characters that I thought were like well established and had a great dynamic between the two of them and were interesting in and of themselves. Again, I love the non-human perspective. I can't think of a lot of books I've read that don't have human protagonists when it comes to epic fantasy. So for me, that was a delight. Definitely, I've read a few and I tend to love them because they're different. And I thought the fantasy was great, and especially I was a little bit nervous going into this one that like elves and fae tend to be very cutesy topics in general. Like there's a lot of these type of books that are typically written for a YA audience. This one is considered to be adult. And I'm happy that with that came a good amount of grit and darkness to it. It's not grimdark by any means, but it paints a less than rosy picture of the elves. The fae are not all cutesy and sparkly, but have their own strife and challenges. And it's really about these two groups and how they have this dark history and all of that. So I love this one. Again, it's a startup for a longer running series, and I will definitely come back for book 2 and everything else that is coming. And honestly, I just want to read book 1 because I can't stop thinking about it and I just want to read it again. And I also read The Blade itself and its sequels that make up the trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This is one I've been meaning to get back to for oh so long. So if you're a long-time watcher of my channel, I did technically read The Blade itself many years ago. It was when I was first getting into adult fantasy, and like many people who are getting into it, you kind of Google the popular titles, you watch some videos, and Joe Abercrombie's name always showed up. So way back when I read The Blade itself, and I didn't really love it. It didn't seem to have a lot of plot, and I didn't really connect with the characters enough to feel compelled to continue on. However, given the fact that I love dark things, given the fact that everyone praises the character work of the series, I went back. So I did reread book 1 because I feel like I didn't give it a fair shot. I was just so new to the genre and I wasn't quite aware of what I was getting myself into. Rereading the first book, I will stand by the fact that this book does not have a lot of plot. It certainly does have things that are happening to a degree, but it's so much more about following the characters, and thankfully the characters this time did appeal to me more. I don't think that they're my all-time favorite characters compared to some like the boys in the Lies of Locke Lamora or the characters in the Greenbone Saga. They're not at that tier for me. And so I like this book and the rest of the series, but more at like a 4-star level rather than being a new all-time favorite. But I really like Logan and I really like Glotka, which has a really impossible name to say on camera. I still didn't love book 1. I think that was only 3.5 stars, but the second book was better and the third book in my mind was even better. And again, it really came down to spending more time with the characters, and I was more invested by the end. I just cared about them more. I enjoyed Glotka's humor, the strange interrelationships, and everyone says it's like the darkest series you'll ever read, and I think it really depends on what you're comparing it to or what aspects you use to define a darkness of a series. Definitely there's bad things that happen to bad people, there's torture and so forth, but I don't think it's not digestible because of the way it's presented. You are presented following these characters that you will ultimately like, and so because of that, I found it to be a pretty easy read. I think that the author has some great chops when it comes to writing. I would certainly read more of like the other books in these companion series that come afterwards. I'm not rushing to pick them up, only again because this isn't an all-time all-time favorite for me. And I say that respectfully. I know everyone else on the internet adores the series, gives it 5 stars. I liked it. It could still be a favorite of the year depending on how things knock out, but I'm glad I finally checked it out, and I will definitely read more by the author. And because I had nothing to do but lay on my back for a while, I read Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. And this, of course, is a classic style epic fantasy story. The writing in it is beautiful. I really appreciate why people love this author so much. It again felt very traditional and it wasn't quite a favorite for me, but I appreciated a lot going along, and it was just a very pleasing book to consume. And then I went on to read Under Heaven, also by the same author. This one I like to touch more, mostly due to the fact that it is more inspired by Chinese historical culture, and it's just a combination of fantasy and a historical period that I find completely fascinating. So for this one, it just happened to match my interest a little bit more, but again, same fantastic writing. I thought the characters were interesting and just this large epic story, and it just felt again very rich to read something like this. So while this author is not again an all-time favorite for me, just because I'm not someone enamored by these type of narrative stories quite to that degree, I still 100% appreciate what this author does. And for me, if you're going to check out this author's work, I say Under Heaven. I think it's one of their best that I've read so far of these two. You might have other opinions, so feel free to drop them down below. If you're looking for an author with, again, really good prose, if that's important to you, you definitely should be checking out this author's work because, again, I'm not someone who always praises prose, but I could tell his stuff was top-notch and it was really pleasing to read. And I want to briefly mention my patron pick for the spring. So every season, my top tier patrons get to submit a book, and one of them is selected for my seasonal TBR. This one was The Daughter of Smoke and Bones by Laini Taylor. This is a YA fantasy book, again, a age category. I don't read a lot, but I'm really glad I checked this one out because of the fact that I had a great time reading it. It starts out in Prague. We follow this art student, and there is this other world that they experience and are pulled into. There is some romance in the story, which usually would be a huge no, red flag, negative, but I kind of shipped the couple. I think just the Prague setting, the more European, otherworldly parts of the story just worked really well. I completely get the hype. While this is not necessarily my go-to genre, again, it's not a book that I consider to be the best fantasy I've ever read. I had a really good time reading it. I definitely would read more in this series. I really should get back to it, especially when I have this extra reading time. And thank you to the patron who suggested this. It was a great escapist read, a lot of fun, and I'm so glad that I finally got the excuse to pick it up. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know of the books I talk about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And if you had a week of bed rest where you just had to lay on your back and you couldn't really move, what book would you finally read from your TBR? Let me know down below in the comments. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of fantasy as well as science fiction, horror, thrillers, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, you can hit that subscribe button, you can hit the notification bell, and you can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji like a spaceship or a dragon. It lets me know you're here and watching. If you want to stick around, I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thanks so much. Okay, bye-bye.